All right, I got a fan out there. Did you hear that little baby? That's awesome. I need her in the next service too. That's great. Welcome. I am Pastor Roy. I'm one of the pastors here at the church. My title is the Connection and Counseling Pastor, so I've been around this church too for a very long time. I started on staff back in 2002. That's how long ago that was. So I was just talking to one of our keyboard players who we've been in the church about the same amount of time. We landed in May and they landed in July of that year, and man, we just watched our kids grow up together in this church and all kinds of blessings and things that God's done and the changes and the time that we've been here. And Pastor Christian and I actually were on staff together way back when in those days. And then God moved us both at different times. So he went down to Florida to plant a church, and I went up to Canada, two very different places, and temperatures, climates, all that stuff. But then God brought us back here working together, and so thankful for that, and thankful for the different influences on our lives back then. He was the youth pastor back then, and my daughters were influenced and blessed by his ministry in that time and continued to do so today. I was the children's pastor, and so I ran around with the kids and we did a whole bunch of fun stuff together back in those days and watched God use us in those directions. And then when we came back from the church planting worlds, now we're both matured now, dealing with adults. I don't know about matured, but we're dealing with adults now and having a good time ministering in the Lord in that way. Today, I get to kick off our series about marriage and the family. And so I enjoy this conversation and these topics. And so though today is the kickoff of the sermon series, we actually had a kickoff of the theme of this kind of ministry on Friday night. So we had a wonderful informed parenting conference. There was at least 120, 130 people in the room here. And we got to hear some dynamic things about how to raise your kids. And Dr. Mormon, who was our guest, he just such a smart guy. He talked about the brain and how we can help our children with anxiety and stresses and the function of the brain in relationship to that. It was just an incredible thing. Like the night my wife and I and Brenda, who was moderating the meeting with us, we sat in the green room, and as he was talking, we were like, oh man, if I only knew these things when we were raising our kids, right? And so we're thankful that was something we could pass on to you. And we plan to, by Tuesday, to have some information out for general public, because it was just a phenomenal conversation about kids and how to raise them. And so if you were able to be here that night, I hope that you were blessed by it. I know I got several comments in the lobby this morning when people saw me, so I appreciate that very much. A big encouragement. We're going to be offering things like that as we can more often. But today is the kickoff, of course, about marriage and the family. So I just want to take us back to the origin of the family. Like, how did this whole thing start, and what did God put together, and how did he form who we are today? So many times you go to see a counselor or a psychologist or a pastor or somebody that kind of gives you some direction when you run into some roadblocks. And these roadblocks all have answers from way back when, straight out of the Bible from God, believe it or not. All these things come out of him and flow through him. So as we think about this today, I want it to be helpful to you. So you may be in the room and you've been married, and you can use some of these things or reminders about things. Or you may be in the room and you may be single, and you're contemplating, one of these days I'll be married, and what's that supposed to look like? Or you may be in trouble in a marriage, and you're like, man, I wish that as I'm hearing these things that I can apply them to my life and bring them forward in my marriage and try to be the best that I can be, right? So the foundational truths that we're going to talk about today. Maybe you've come to the church and you're living with somebody and you've heard, hey, you should get married, don't live together. Maybe those are some of the themes that you're hearing. And maybe when you hear that, you're thinking, why? Right? I don't know where you're at on that. But that might be something that, well, here's the why. And this is the things that God puts together and what his purpose is so that you can hear just exactly where God is planning and how he forms relationships and what his hand has in all of that. So let's look at the passage here in Genesis. This is the first family. This is Adam and Eve we're going to be talking about. And the Lord said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Isn't that great? Every time I read that, I'm like, yes, I need that helper in my life, because I know it's not just God looking down at me and saying, it's not good for this guy to be alone. I know for myself, I'm like, yeah, this isn't good for me. All right, let's keep on going. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of man's ribs and then closed it in the place with flesh. And the Lord God made the woman from the rib that he had taken out of man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken out of man. And that is why a man leaves his father and mother and united to his wife, and the two become one flesh." Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. And then I want to go forward into a New Testament passage when Jesus kind of gives his a stamp of this is the way it's supposed to be. He was talking to Pharisees and others who asked him the big question about, what about divorce here? And he said, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore," and this is the big statement from Jesus here, "what God has joined together, let no man separate." I want to talk to you today about just three foundational words that we're going to find out of this passage in Genesis, and then reiterated by Jesus in the New Testament, because these are healthy, helpful things that today, if we can hear them and put them into our lives, then God can use them for his honor and for his glory. The first word I want you to see is one. He brought them together and he said, "You will be one flesh." Now, what does that mean? Well, physically, it just means that this man and this woman, they came together and they were one flesh. That's the concept here. So how exactly does that spell out? Well, in the basic sense of it, and because I don't know Hebrew, I went to somebody who does. And so I went online and I read a few articles from a man by the name of Rabbi Manis Friedman. And he took apart some Hebrew words out of this passage and took the word that is described for man and the word that's described for woman, or male kind of form of the word and the female form of the word, and said they are one. And in its strictest sense, this is the physical union. It is the sexual experience between man and woman. Now, that'd be great if one just meant that's all it is. We are doing it, and so boom, we are one. Wouldn't that be great? Yes, we accomplished it. But it doesn't work that way. Actually, in this article, Rabbi Manis goes on to explain, hey, it's one not only in that, but in spiritual sense, the physical sense, and the emotional sense. So how do we get to this place of one? And I think that it's in the language of that text where God says they will become one flesh. So it's always a process of becoming. How do we become one? How do we stay one? Because that's tough, right? I would love to say my wife and I are always one, but we're not. And that's a struggle. So here's some other words that God gives us out of this text. So maybe these are things you've not thought through, but we're going to think about them today. First word is leave. Well, what's the big deal about leave? I married this guy or married this woman, and we leave the house that we were in. We come together as one. Well, leaving is a very big part of coming together because it means I am leaving the place and the influences and the power in my life and now putting it together as one. And the leaving has to do with I am now forming and building a family that God would have us build together. And so that leaving requires me giving up a few things and pulling together some of the best things from my background, putting them into this new marriage and being able to shed some things that were not so good in the family I grew up in. And that sounds like a wonderful thing. Yay, we can create this together, but still difficult, isn't it? Leaving means not only about that physical place. It doesn't mean that every time you go to your parents' house and you're getting ready to leave, you're just like, hey, just so you know, I'm not coming back here to live. Like, you don't have to do that, right? You don't remind your parents of that. But it might be a leaving because there's the emotional attachment that's there, right? And man, I'm just going to tell everything to mom and dad about what's going on, and I need to make sure I've got my posse with me about, this guy or this woman and the way that they're treating me. Oh, that's not the way it works. You become one, and you're going to work things out, and you're going to give yourselves to each other, and we're going to make the part of being one so that we're leaving these things and putting ourselves into the other. The next word is even harder. Man, leaving is kind of simple, especially if you grew up in a home where like, I'm glad to be rid of that. But here's the next one. How about cleaving? This is the work. How do I cleave to this person? Man, such an awesome word, but such a tough word. When you think of cleaving to someone, in one of the articles, Christian Questions article, it was talking about this word cleave, and its original context has the image of two pieces of paper being glued together. And so much so glued together that you can't tell where one begins and the other ends. And so it's about the glue. And if you were to tear these pieces of paper apart, neither one come out structurally sound anymore, and it's just kind of disastrous. But that cleaving is like this glue. The other piece that is talked about is that this is not only glue, but it's pursue. So if I'm cleaving, I am always pursuing with my wife that great relationship, those pieces that are about her that I need to learn more about, those pieces about what it means to be healthy. So I am cleaving all the time. I'm cleaving, I'm giving myself. And that's what it means to cleave, to glue and pursue. Here's a statement I want you to see about cleaving. Cleaving is the intentional work of actively loving my spouse as they wish to be loved. Wow. Think about that. As they wish to be loved. That gives up selfishness, because sometimes that's the biggest issue when it comes to cleaving. And I just need to give myself over to this person and some of the ways that we're to love each other. And I'm to try to cleave to this person in some way that makes sense of us. When I was preparing and pulling out some material for this message, I came across a book from Weekend to Remember. Now, this is a ministry out of Family Life Ministries, and it's a weekend away. They give you a workbook. You go off Friday night to Sunday about noon, and there's all these workshops and keynote speakers, and you have a date night on Saturday night, and you're just out for the weekend. And it's a really good, refreshing time. And as I was reading through some of the concepts of being one and what are the threats to being one, some of the great points out of this weekend conference, I came across one of the exercises we had to do. So one of the exercises on Saturday morning was she gave me her workbook, and she wrote a love note. There's a couple pages to write a love letter to your spouse. And then I took her workbook and I went and wrote, or wait a minute, did I say that already? She took my book and I took her book. That's the way it goes. It's simpler than the way I was trying to describe it. So I had my workbook back from the love letter that she wrote me way back then. We went to this Weekend to Remember in 2001. At the time, we were living on Long Island. We were away for that little weekend. And I hadn't picked this up or looked at it probably since 2001. So I decided, well, this is interesting. I'm going to read this love letter from my wife and see what she had to say. And as I read it, it struck me that, wow, I'm not doing some of these things she told me I was good at. And I started to realize the themes that she had for me was, I love you because you're kind, you're gentle, and you're patient. Man, that hit me because I'm like, gee, I know that this is not the way she's experiencing me right now. I know some stressors have come into my life, and I know there's some things that I'm just like ramped up in whatever area of my life. You don't need to know all that. You don't want to hear all that. I just know that what my wife has been experiencing is not patient, gentle, or kind, which are, by the way, 3 of the things that Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that love is. It's like patient, gentle, and kind. And so I know for me to cleave, I got to somehow get back to that place, and I need to give her what she sees in me that I am missing. So she was, when I told her about this love letter that I read again, she was like, I don't even know where my book is. So I have to write her another letter. I'm just kidding. I hope that I always feel that love place from her, right? And so if we look, we can find it because that helps us to cleave. The next thing about being one is also about unity. Now, unity no, duh, Roy, is that supposed to be there, unity? But unity, let me give you the points on what unity is and it's not. What unity is not is that just because you came together in marriage, you're going to have unity. That, number one, that's not going to happen. Number 2 is that you will agree on everything, and that's not true either, right? If you've been married for any length of time or been in a relationship, period, you know you're not going to agree with everything. And it's different because, you can have a disagreement with your buddy, and you guys can, go back and forth about things, and then it's like, okay, have a good day, and there's no repercussions from it. But in a romantic relationship, it gets sticky, doesn't it? Like, why don't you agree with me on this? Like, we need to talk through this. And sometimes it's not about having to pull this person into an agreement with you. But it's about learning to have the uniqueness and the individuality that's happening in those moments. A great psychologist and researcher of marriages and relationships, his name is John Gottman from out in California. And his big research discovered that 69% of the things that we have as arguments or little conflicts in our marriage will never be resolved. Now think about that. That's a tough statistic. It's like, wow, 69% of this is never going to be resolved. And that's so, if you look into your marriage and you're like, yeah, it's pretty telling. I can't talk about too many things we've actually accomplished through what's happening in some conflict. But the conflict is not something to be afraid of sometimes, or that you have to be in agreement, but it's something to look at and say, that conflict sometimes is just the revelation of there are 2 different opinions, and that's all there is to it. And being able to accept that helps us to have unity with each other. Let me give you a second word here. I said there's 3 words. Second word is naked. Whoa. Where is he going with this one, right? Naked. I want you to know that this word in talking about it in Genesis, it's talking about naked and being unashamed. So these two people were naked and unashamed. It points to a piece of innocence. It points to a piece of just sheer joy because they were together and God put them there. So naked has these three ideas to it. Number one is that there's truth. There's no hiding when you're naked. I mean, it's all out there. You just can't, not be truthful. A marriage that starts to fall in the path of, I'm just going to keep this from her or that from him, all of a sudden you're running into trouble. So naked has this connotation here that we are supposed to be truthful. There's a lot of reasons why we may not keep the whole truth, right? I know if I'm looking into myself, I'm thinking, I'm not going to say this to Tracy because we're just going to have an argument. Is that helpful? Not at all. I need to still be truthful, even if it's going to cause a little bit of friction between us, right? So we're not hiding, we're not ashamed, but we're truthful. The next thing is that we're just going to be vulnerable. Oh, that word. Every time I'm in a setting and somebody says, okay, we're just going to be open and not vulnerable. And I'm like, nope. I heard there was snacks here. Is there any good snacks? Because this isn't where I want to go. But it is about being open and vulnerable, right? There is not when you have nothing to hide and you're naked, there is nothing there but being open for each other and being vulnerable to each other. And there's sometimes Tracy has to hear all my stuff, and it's because I'm being vulnerable. Vulnerable means that you're trusting too. Like it's just a giving. If I'm going to be vulnerable, it means that I have seen this person of trust in my life, and so I'm going to be open and vulnerable each and every time to them. The next thing about this point is just about uniqueness. We all are unique. We're uniquely made by God, and we have things unique about us because we come from our different backgrounds, and God has placed those things in us. When we are unique and we come together as a couple, sometimes that uniqueness is what draws us together, right? And I love how you're so different than me and all these wonderful things. And the interesting thing about that uniqueness piece is that opposites attract and then opposites attack. So sometimes, those same differences that were so wonderful when you came together become so frustrating the longer you go into the relationship. Now look, I'm telling you this from experience. So everybody in this room that's about 50 years old or better, and you've been married at least 25 years or more, we are mentoring right now. So just say amen to me about what's going on here and what I'm saying. It gets tougher the longer you're together sometimes because, man, it's been 34 years and I'm putting up with all this. And Tracy might say to me, hey, idiot, I've told you several times the same thing. And I'm just like, hey, apparently I need to hear it just one more time, right? Because I'm not getting it, but I know that this woman is unique. And when I allow her to be everything she is of Christ for me, then that's help for me. And God's going to do something through me. He's going to sharpen me. He's going to make me the man that I'm supposed to be because of the woman she was designed to be. The last thing I want to give you, and the band will be joining us on stage here soon, but I want to give you this word, communion, because communion was happening. In that beautiful scene where God has put Adam to sleep and he takes the rib out and he brings this up before him, this beautiful woman who is now his helpmeet. He said she will be bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and we're going to dwell together. And this is going to be a wonderful thing. And so they had that. It was beautiful. Just think of that communion that was together and how wonderful they engaged with each other. And then they had communion with each other. But this communion was broken, sadly, in chapter 3 when we read about the fall of man and everything that happened. Then communion was broken. Man, it was tough. You think about what happened to poor Eve in this situation. because they were confronted about their sin. The story in Genesis here is that Adam and Eve were together and they ate the forbidden fruit. They ate this fruit that was of the tree of good and evil of knowledge. And so they partook of that, and then when they were confronted about it, Adam says, "This woman you gave me," he blamed her right away. Now think about what that did to their communion. Think about the heaviness that just fell on Eve because this guy just said this to me. It was a betrayal. It was a break of trust. It was so many things that just happened when he decided that she was the problem. And the passage there says that she took of the fruit, she gave it to Adam with him. So the two of them were together, and yet she's to blame. Oh, wow, how crushing that is. And communion broken. And maybe today I'm just saying, maybe there's something that's happened where communion is broken, trust is broken, and we need to rebuild this. God can do it. He is faithful. That communion, that peace can be brought back together. Sometimes it's not easy because if you're like me and you've been in the marriage for so many years and you're just getting sick and tired of the same thing over and over, it gets tough. But God has answers. He wants communion for each of you. The next thing is about communion with God. Oh, this is a sweet piece. Because in that passage of scripture, it said they heard the voice of God through the garden. Oh, I think of that and I think, wow, how wonderful that experience would have been it was a continual happening daily kind of thing where they would hear the voice of God in the garden. Man, I want to hear the voice of God. I want to hear the voice of God together with my wife and what kind of things we're supposed to do moving forward. God communing with us. How wonderful that peace is. Giving yourselves over to Him. We prayed about it right at the beginning of the service, like, dear Lord, we want to be a sacrifice to you, a surrender to you. And when we do that, there's communion with Him. And so today, as we're going through these pieces and these foundational words, just remember, from the beginning, whatever is bringing you to the place where I'm thinking about marriage or the best things I want to do in marriage, remember, we're to be one. We're to be naked for each other, and we are to have communion with each other. Will you bow your heads with me in prayer?